The nursery was already painted. Yellow walls, a second-hand crib lined with a white knit blanket her mother had made, a stuffed bear seated in the corner like a sentry waiting for the new arrival. Carol Harmon had done everything right. She had boiled the bottles, folded the tiny onesies, taped a hand-drawn sign to the front door that read "Baby coming soon." In her careful, looping cursive, what she had not done, what no one ever does, is prepare for the other thing. The thing that doesn't show up in any baby book ever written. On October 14, 1993, in the farming community of Millbrook, Tennessee, population Forthans 200, Carol Harmon gave birth to a 7-pound, 3-ounce boy. The labor lasted 11 hours. Daniel Harmon, her husband of 4 years, held her hand through all of it. At 11:42 p.m., a nurse placed a small, red-faced, breathing miracle into Carol's arms. Daniel kissed his wife on the forehead, whispered something in her ear, told her he was going to make a quick call. His mother was still waiting for the news, and stepped out of the maternity ward. He never came back. What happened to Daniel Harmon in the hours after his son was born would go unanswered for 33 years. The answer, when it finally arrived, would come from the boy himself, the one who had spent his entire life being told his father was a man who loved him and left him in the same night. Before we get to any of that, we have to go back to Millbrook, because to understand what was lost, you first have to understand who Daniel Harmon was. Daniel was 29 years old in the fall of 1993. He worked the day shift at the Millbrook Steel and Parts Plant, a sheet metal fabrication facility that had employed half the men in the county for 4 decades. He drove a 1989 Ford F-150, the color of forest green, kept a CB radio mounted above the dash, a habit left over from the years when that was how men in small towns talked to each other across country roads, and was known at the plant for keeping a photograph of Carol pinned above his workstation long before she ever became his wife. He had proposed to her at the Millbrook Diner in a corner booth on a Tuesday morning with a ring he had spent 6 months saving for by working overtime every weekend. She said yes before he finished the sentence. In 1993, Millbrook was the kind of place where the hardware store carried the same family name above the door as the family that built it in 1948, where the high school football schedule was front-page news every September, and the church Christmas play sold out every November. The economy ran on the steel plant and the tobacco farms that lined the county roads. Most families had at least one member working one or the other. People left their cars unlocked. Children walked to school by themselves. The Millbrook Gazette printed birth announcements before it printed anything else. Daniel and Carol had met in high school, the way people met in Millbrook, at Friday night games, at graduation parties, at the same church their parents had attended before either of them was born. He was the kind of man who shoveled his elderly neighbor's driveway without being asked, and who coached Little League one summer when the regular coach broke his ankle. He wasn't loud about any of it. He fixed things. He showed up. He paid his bills on time and kept the gutters clean and was, by every account from everyone who knew him, exactly the kind of man you'd want sitting beside you in a hospital room at 11:42 on a Thursday night when the world was about to change. He had one specific habit that Carol mentioned in every account she ever gave. Before leaving the house each morning, he would stand in the doorway, not quite inside, not quite out, and count quietly to himself. 3 seconds. Every single day. She once asked him why. He said it was to make sure he hadn't forgotten anything important. It was something his own father had taught him. She never thought much of it, until she understood what it meant when a man goes to a doorway and doesn't come back through it. The last time Carol saw her husband fully, consciously present, he was kissing her forehead. She was holding their newborn son. Marcus Daniel Harmon had been in the world for 11 minutes. The maternity ward at Millbrook General Hospital occupied the third floor of a building that had been extended 3 times since 1962. There was one elevator, one set of stairs at the corridor's far end, and a payphone mounted near the nurse's station. The same payphone Daniel had used 3 months earlier to call Carol's mother when the first ultrasound confirmed a boy. At 11:53 p.m., 11 minutes after Marcus was born, a nurse named Helen Pruitt saw Daniel Harmon step off the elevator into the main lobby. She noted the time because she was finishing a shift report and logged it from habit. He was wearing his blue flannel shirt, the one with the fraying cuff on the left sleeve that Carol had kept meaning to repair, and he was moving toward the lobby payphones with purpose. Not running, but quick. By midnight, the lobby was quiet. At 12:14 a.m., Carol asked a nurse to bring Daniel back in. She wanted to try nursing the baby. The nurse checked the corridor. The payphone alcove was empty. She paged Daniel Harmon over the hospital intercom. The sound traveled through the building once, twice, no response. By 1 loc a.m., 2 nurses and a security guard had walked the entire third floor. Nothing. By 2 loc a.m., Carol Harmon was no longer nursing her son. She was sitting upright in the hospital bed, staring at the doorway, while Marcus slept against her chest. At 6:17 a.m. On October 15, 1993, Carol's brother David drove to the house on Millard Street. Daniel's green F-150 was in the driveway. Engine cold, doors locked. The porch light was still on. Carol had left it on the way she always did when Daniel was out late. 2 days of newspapers sat rolled on the front step. Whatever had happened to Daniel Harmon after he walked through that hospital lobby, it had not ended at home. The missing persons report Carol filed that morning ran to half a page. The deputy who took it, a 22-year-old named Ellis Breck, 7 months into his first posting, listened carefully and then said the words that Carol Harmon would spend the next 3 decades trying to forget. He said, "Mrs. Harmon, sometimes new fathers get overwhelmed." She was still in her hospital gown. She had Marcus in her arms. She had been awake for 31 hours. She looked at the deputy for a long moment. Then she said, Daniel Harmon was not overwhelmed. Something happened to him. She was right. It would just take 33 years to prove it. There was one detail that went unrecorded in those first 48 hours. Nurse Helen Pruitt mentioned it once, in passing, during an early interview that was never formally followed up. She had seen Daniel near the lobby entrance just before midnight. He was at the payphone. But he was not the only person in that lobby. There had been another man, heavyset, wearing a jacket she described as dark gray or possibly dark green, seated in the plastic waiting chairs near the elevator bank. Visiting hours had ended at 9:00 p.m. She had thought it unusual. She had not spoken to him. She had not gotten a clear look at his face. The lead investigator assigned to Daniel Harmon's case was Detective Gerald Mowry of the Millbrook Sheriff's Office, a 47-year-old whose career had been built largely on insurance fraud and stolen farm equipment, and who privately told his wife during the first week of the investigation that Daniel Harmon had probably walked away from a life he wasn't ready for. It was a theory he held quietly, but never fully released, and it shaped everything that followed. 3 suspects emerged in the first 3 months. The first was a man named Ray Cutler, Daniel's supervisor at the steel plant, and someone who owed Daniel nearly $400 from a series of informal loans that had never been repaid. Cutler had an alibi for the night of October 14th, a church dinner 20 miles away, confirmed by 8 witnesses. He was eliminated in December. The second was Carol's former boyfriend, a man named Tom Vesper, who had relocated to Knoxville in 1991. Vesper agreed to a voluntary interview, passed a polygraph, and was gone from the investigation by January 1994. The third was not a person, but a theory. Several of Daniel's co-workers mentioned that he had seemed quietly worried in the 2 weeks before Marcus was born. One man, a welder named Dave Lyle, who worked the station beside Daniel's, said Daniel had received a phone call at the plant in early October that had visibly shaken him. Daniel had not said anything about it. He had gone back to his workstation and never brought it up. Detective Mowry's notes from the Lyle interview ran to less than half a page. No follow-up calls were documented. The lead effectively ended there. Meanwhile, Carol did what Carol did. She went home from the hospital after 3 days. She learned to change diapers alone. She nursed Marcus at 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. and sat by the kitchen window in the hours between and stared out at the driveway where Daniel's truck still sat, because she could not bring herself to move it. Her mother came to help for 2 weeks. Her sister drove up on weekends. The church brought food, casseroles and coffee cake and covered dishes that stacked on the counter because Carol had no appetite. She called the sheriff's office every Monday for 8 months. In the spring of 1994, Detective Mowry transferred to the county assessor's office. The Harmon case was reassigned to a deputy who left the department 6 months after that. By 1995, no one at the Millbrook Sheriff's Office was actively working the disappearance of Daniel Harmon. The case went cold before Marcus learned to walk. By 1997, 4 years had passed. Marcus had just turned 3. He had dark hair like his father and a habit of sitting in the driveway beside Daniel's truck and talking quietly to the steering wheel as though he expected an answer. Carol watched him through the kitchen window. By 2001, Marcus was in 2nd grade. His teacher mentioned, gently, at a parent-teacher conference that Marcus had a hard time with the question the other children answered easily. "What does your dad do?" Carol drove home from that conference without speaking. By 2005, Daniel's truck finally had to be sold. The engine had given out. Carol sat in the driveway for 20 minutes before handing the keys to the man she sold it to for $400. Marcus watched from the front step. He was 12. The reward poster that went up in the window of the Millbrook Diner in November 1993 stayed there for 11 years. By 2004, it had faded to almost nothing, the photograph of Daniel barely visible through the sun-bleached plastic sleeve. When a new family bought the diner in 2005, the poster came down without ceremony during the renovation. Through all of it, one person refused to stop. Not Carol, though she never stopped believing, but a woman named Virginia Pruitt, the mother of nurse Helen Pruitt. Virginia had worked as a courthouse clerk for 31 years. She had a deep personal conviction that records told the truth when people wouldn't. She kept her own file on Daniel's case in a binder in her home office. She cross-referenced every public record she could access: property transfers, business filings, vehicle registrations, looking for anything that connected to Daniel or to the heavy-set man her daughter had described in that hospital lobby. By 2010, Marcus was 17 years old. He found, among his mother's things, a shoebox. Inside, Daniel's wallet, which had been recovered from the hospital parking lot 2 days after the disappearance and returned to Carol. His driver's license. $43 in folded bills. A scrap of paper with Carol's room number written on it. And a small, creased snapshot of an ultrasound image with the words "Our boy" written in Daniel's handwriting across the bottom. Marcus sat in his bedroom and held it for a long time. He said later that was the night he decided. Every case on this channel is the result of weeks of digging through records, verifying facts, and piecing together real lives that deserve better. If this story matters to you, take a moment to like and subscribe, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Your support is what makes it possible to keep telling these stories. Now, let's get back to Marcus Harmon. By 2015, Marcus was 22. He had his father's jawline and his mother's eyes, and a forensic science degree. He was 3 semesters away from finishing at the University of Tennessee. He had called the Millbrook Sheriff's Office twice during his freshman year, hoping someone had looked at the case recently. They hadn't. Something had to change. And in the winter of 2022, something finally did. Marcus Harmon came home for Christmas that year with a laptop and a request. He asked his mother to sit with him and go through everything she had ever saved about his father's disappearance. They sat at the kitchen table for 2 days. On the second evening, Carol brought out Virginia Pruitt's binder. Virginia had passed away in 2018, and her daughter had delivered the binder to Carol in a paper grocery bag with a note attached that read only, "She wanted you to have this." Carol had set it on a shelf and had not been able to open it. Marcus opened it. Inside, on a handwritten page dated April 2008, Virginia had flagged a business registration. A man named Harold Gage had incorporated a small trucking company in Millbrook County in September 1993, 6 weeks before Daniel disappeared, and Daniel Harmon was listed as a co-signer on the initial filing. The company had been dissolved in November 1993, 4 weeks after Daniel vanished. Virginia had circled Gage's name in red ink. Beside it, a single handwritten question: "Who is this?" Marcus ran the name. Harold Gage had died in 2014. But his son, a man named Roy Gage, still lived 30 miles outside Millbrook in a town called Cedar Fork. Marcus located 3 addresses associated with Roy Gage in public records going back to 1993. The third, a rented property on County Road 14, had been leased by Roy Gage from October 1993 through February 1994. Marcus took what he had to a cold case investigator he had contacted through the university, a retired Tennessee Bureau of Investigation agent named Sandra Keel, who had spent 22 years working disappearances. He laid out the binder, the registration, the timeline. Sandra Keel read through it twice. Then she set the papers down and said, "Tell me again about the man in the hospital waiting room." Marcus told her everything his mother had remembered from Nurse Pruitt's original account. Sandra picked up her phone. 2 weeks later, she had obtained the original visitor log from Millbrook General Hospital dated October 14, 1993, not the security footage, which had long since been destroyed, but the badge issue log that the hospital had kept in its administrative archive. Records documented every visitor badge issued that night. And there, entered at 10:37 p.m., under the name of a patient who did not exist, was a single visitor entry signed under the name R. Gage. He had been in that hospital the night Daniel Harmon disappeared. He had arrived more than an hour before Daniel stepped off the elevator. He had been sitting there, waiting. In the 4 months that followed, Sandra Keel and Marcus Harmon built a case file that stretched to over 200 pages. Roy Gage was 61 years old. He had spent his entire adult life in Cedar Fork, worked at a feed store for 20 years, coached youth soccer for a decade, attended the same Baptist church every Sunday morning. His neighbors described him as quiet, reliable, private, but in the way men of that generation tended to be private. Nobody who knew him had any reason to look twice. The records told a different story. Roy Gage's father, Harold, had approached Daniel Harmon in August 1993 with a proposition. Harold ran a small trucking operation with bookkeeping that did not survive close scrutiny. He needed a front signer on a new business registration to create separation between the money and his own name. Daniel, young, trusting, expecting a child in 2 months, had agreed, believing he was doing Harold a simple favor. He did not fully understand what he had signed. By October, court documents confirmed he did. Phone records that Sandra located through a 1993 county telecommunications archive showed Daniel had attempted to reach Harold Gage 3 times in the 2 weeks before Marcus was born. He intended to go to the sheriff the following week to disclose the arrangement and remove his name from it. Harold Gage had not been answering those calls. Roy Gage had. On October 14, 1993, Roy Gage drove to Millbrook General Hospital and signed in under a false name with a visitor badge listing a patient who did not exist. He knew Daniel was there. Daniel had called from the plant that afternoon and told Roy directly that he planned to go to the sheriff the following Monday. What happened in that lobby, what passed between Roy Gage and Daniel Harmon in the minutes after Daniel stepped off that elevator, became the subject of a Tennessee Bureau of Investigation interview in March 2023. Roy Gage declined to cooperate. He hired an attorney and did not speak. But the evidence did not need him to speak. A cell tower record, recovered from a telecommunications archive through long-standing TBI access protocols, placed Roy Gage's phone within 1 mile of Millbrook General Hospital at 11:48 p.m. On October 14, 1993, a 3-day excavation of the property on County Road 14, the property Roy Gage had vacated in February 1994, 4 months after Daniel disappeared, produced the partial skeletal remains of a man consistent in age and physical description with Daniel Harmon. DNA analysis confirmed the identification. On August 7, 2023, Roy Gage was arrested at his home in Cedar Fork. His neighbors watched from their driveways. Several said afterward they simply could not account for it. A woman who had lived beside Roy Gage for 30 years told a local reporter, "He was the most normal person I have ever known." That is almost always what they say. Roy Gage pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in December 2023 to avoid a jury trial. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Carol Harmon was 57 years old when she learned what happened to her husband. She was sitting in the kitchen, the same kitchen where she had sat alone through 7 winters of 2 o'clock a.m. feedings when Sandra Keel called with the Dina confirmation. Marcus was beside her. He held her hand. She sat very still for a long time. Then she said, "I knew he didn't leave us." She said it the way a person says something they have been holding for 33 years. Not with triumph, with exhaustion, with the quiet grief that comes from being right about something that no one believed. Daniel Harmon was 29 years old the night his son was born. He was the kind of man who shoveled driveways without being asked and saved money for people he loved and kept a photograph of his wife pinned above his workstation long before she was ever his wife. He stood in doorways and counted to 3 to make sure he hadn't forgotten anything. He called his mother from payphones. He drove a truck the color of forest and loved a woman who said yes before he finished asking. He had a whole life mapped out, a son to raise, a house on Millard Street, mornings he would never get to have. He never got to know his boy. He never got to watch the child who would spend 33 years refusing to let a shoebox and a courthouse clerk's handwritten notes be the end of the story. Marcus Harmon finished his forensic science degree. He went on to work with a cold case nonprofit, helping families of other missing persons navigate systems that had given up on them. He named his organization the Daniel Harmon Foundation. He said in an interview that it was not really about justice. He said it was about the families who sit at kitchen tables every single night, still waiting, the ones who never got a binder, the ones who are still looking. The case prompted change in Millbrook. The sheriff's office established a formal cold case review unit in 2024, the first in the county's history. Everyone who works there knows why it exists. What do we owe a man who was taken the night he became a father? What does it mean that the truth was sitting in a binder on a courthouse clerk's shelf for 14 years, waiting for someone to open it? And what does it say about us? About what ordinary people are capable of? When a son who never knew his father picks up a file that the system abandoned and refuses to set it down. Justice came for Daniel Harmon. It came 33 years late, and it came through the hands of the boy he never got to raise. If that matters to you, if you believe the truth is worth whatever it takes to find it, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More stories are waiting in the description below. Thank you for being here.